Did you notice it too? The cameras were still rolling. The lights were still warm. The speaker was still talking. And yet, seats were empty. Not metaphorically empty. Not, it felt quiet. Empty. Physically empty. Rows with gaps. Chairs no one bothered to return to. Doors opening softly at the back of the room while the speech continued at the front. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. That's the image people can't stop replaying from the 2026 appearance of Meghan Markle and Prince Harry at the Sundance Film Festival. And here's the uncomfortable question no one wanted to ask out loud at the time. What does it mean when people quietly leave while you're still speaking? This wasn't a red carpet premiere where crowds ebb and flow. This wasn't a chaotic press scrum where exits go unnoticed. This was a scheduled Sundance conversation, a controlled room, a seated audience, a moment designed for listening. And yet, people walked. Some early, some halfway through, some after glancing at their phones, exchanging looks, and deciding, silently, that they were done. That's where this story really begins. Not with headlines, not with official photos, not with glowing recaps. It begins with the sound of chairs scraping softly against the floor. Because Sundance isn't just another festival. And this wasn't just another appearance. This was supposed to be a statement. For Meghan and Harry, Sundance 22/6 was framed as something more than attendance. It was positioned as a rival, a cultural checkpoint, a signal that their creative ambitions, particularly their documentary Cookie Queens, belonged in the same serious conversations as indie auteurs, first-time filmmakers, and uncompromising storytellers. Sundance, after all, doesn't run on celebrity fumes. It runs on credibility. And that's why this moment mattered more than anyone expected. From the outside, the setup looked flawless. High-profile names, a purpose-driven documentary, a respected festival, carefully coordinated schedules, the optics of relevance, the language of impact. But inside the room, something wasn't landing. And that disconnect between intention and reception, between message and mood, is what turned this appearance into a talking point long after the event ended. Here's the contradiction that makes this story so uncomfortable. The Sussexes have spent years emphasizing voice, being heard, telling their story on their own terms, speaking truth to systems they say ignored them, reclaiming narrative control. And yet, in this room, during this speech, something very different happened. The audience chose silence, and then, in some cases, absence. So let's slow this down, because moments like this don't exist in isolation. They're built, they're staged, they're misunderstood long before they unravel. To understand why empty seats at Sundance became symbolic, you have to understand what Sundance actually is, and what it absolutely is not. Sundance is not Cannes, it's not the Met Gala, it's not a place where celebrity alone guarantees reverence. If anything, celebrity can be a liability there. The festival was built on skepticism, on discovery, on discomfort, on the idea that storytelling matters more than star power. In Sundance rooms, audiences are sharp. They're opinionated, they're tired of polish, they lean forward when they sense authenticity, and they lean back when they smell branding. That's not cruelty, that's culture. Which raises the first unsettling question for you as a viewer. Did Meghan Markle and Prince Harry misread the room before they ever stepped into it? Because everything about their appearance suggested careful planning. The timing, the positioning, the framing of Cookie Queens as socially conscious, conversation-worthy, Sundance appropriate. And yet, something about the delivery didn't match the expectation of the people sitting there. What was it? Was it the tone? The pacing? The sense that the conversation was less conversation and more performance? Or was it something deeper, something about fatigue, repetition, or perceived distance between speaker and audience? No one stood up and protested. There were no boos. No dramatic confrontations. That's not how Sundance audiences usually express disapproval. They do something far quieter. They disengage. They look down, they stop nodding, they stop reacting, and eventually they leave. And that's what made this moment so striking. Because exits at Sundance are read like reviews. When someone leaves early, it's not seen as rudeness. It's seen as a statement, a judgment rendered without words. And when multiple people leave during the same segment of a speech, insiders notice. So did the speakers. According to multiple attendee accounts circulated afterward, Meghan noticed movement in the room. Not just one person, but a pattern, subtle at first. Then, harder to ignore, a glance toward the middle rows. A pause that lingered a beat too long, a tightening in tone. If that's true, and to be clear, we are talking about perception, not confirmed internal thoughts, it suggests something deeply human happened on that stage. The realization that the room was slipping away. Ask yourself, honestly, how would you react if you were speaking about your work, your purpose, your story, and people started leaving? Would you speed up? Would you double down? Would you push harder, hoping passion could pull them back? Or would something in you harden? This is where the narrative gets complicated, because public figures are expected to absorb rejection gracefully, to smile, to continue, to never reveal irritation, disappointment, or anger. But they're also human, and that tension between the expectation of composure and the reality of emotion is what many believe played out in real time. This wasn't a meltdown. There were no raised voices, no visible outbursts. It was subtler than that, a shift, a sharpness, a tightening of phrasing. Some attendees later described the energy as defensive. Others said it felt tense. A few said it felt like the speech became less about connection and more about assertion. Again, these are perceptions, but perception is everything in a room like that. Meanwhile, Prince Harry sat beside her, listening, watching, largely silent. And that silence mattered too. Because Harry has been in rooms like this before, rooms where expectations and reality don't align. Rooms where the reception isn't what was hoped for. Rooms where the audience's body language tells a story no press release can fix. Which brings us to the larger context. This Sundance appearance didn't happen in a vacuum. It came after years of high-profile interviews, documentaries, speeches, and public reckonings. Some applauded, some criticized, many felt fatigued. And fatigue is dangerous at a festival built on novelty. Sundance thrives on firsts, first voices, first visions, first risks. Even when stories are political or personal, audiences expect them to feel raw, unscripted, and slightly uncomfortable in an honest way. What they resist is repetition. So, when Cookie Queens was introduced, not just as a film, but as part of a broader Sussex narrative, the audience's reaction wasn't just about this project. It was about accumulation. How many times can the same themes be reframed before people stop leaning in? That question may have been hovering in the room long before the first person stood up to leave. And here's the part that makes this moment linger. After the event, coverage focused heavily on attendance, applause, and messaging. Photos were cropped. Angles were chosen. Language was softened. The words "empty seats" didn't appear in most mainstream recaps, but the internet noticed anyway. Attendee posts, side-angle photos, quiet comments, screenshots shared without commentary, the kind of digital breadcrumbs that don't shout, but don't disappear either. Which raises another uncomfortable question. If the moment truly didn't matter, why work so hard to control how it was seen? Because Sundance moments have a way of echoing. A single awkward appearance can follow a creator for years, not loudly, just persistently. And that's why this wasn't just a bad day or a misunderstood speech. It was a test of whether Meghan Markle and Prince Harry could command a room without commanding attention. Whether their presence alone could hold an audience that prides itself on skepticism. Whether their message still felt urgent to people who have heard versions of it before. Some stayed, some listened, some nodded along, and some left. Those exits didn't end the conversation. They started it. Because what happened next didn't unfold on stage. It unfolded in whispers, in industry chatter, in private texts exchanged by people who had been in the room, and in the quiet recalibration that always follows moments like this. But what most people didn't realize at the time was that the empty seats weren't the biggest problem. The real shift happened after the applause faded. And once that shift began, there was no easy way to reverse it. What if the problem wasn't the speech? What if the problem was the room itself? Because once the applause faded and people filtered out of that Sundance space, a quieter realization settled in among those who understood the festival best. This wasn't about one awkward moment or a few restless attendees. This was about a fundamental mismatch, a collision between expectation and culture. And that collision had been building long before Meghan Markle ever stepped up to speak. Here's the uncomfortable truth that many first-timers learned too late. Sundance is not impressed by celebrity. In fact, celebrity can work against you. That sounds counterintuitive, especially in a media landscape where star power opens doors everywhere else. Cannes rolls out carpets. Toronto thrives on premieres. Venice basks in spectacle. Even film festivals that pretend to resist fame quietly benefit from it. But Sundance is different. And if you don't understand why, you misread everything that happens inside those rooms. Sundance was born from resistance. Resistance to studio dominance. Resistance to polished narratives. Resistance to safe storytelling. It was created to amplify voices that didn't already have a microphone. To spotlight people who didn't arrive with entourages or expectations of deference. Which means that when someone walks into a Sundance conversation already famous, already scrutinized, already wrapped in global narratives, the room doesn't automatically lean in. It leans back. Not out of hostility, out of habit. Sundance audiences are trained to ask a silent question the moment someone takes the stage. Why you? Not who are you? Not how famous are you? But why does your story need this room? That question hovers over every speaker, every filmmaker, every panelist. And the more visible you are in the world, the harder that question hits. Because Sundance isn't about amplification, it's about filtration. And here's where things get tricky for someone like Meghan Markle. By the time she arrived in Utah, she wasn't an unknown creative trying to break through. She wasn't a first-time documentarian nervously pitching a raw idea. She wasn't an indie filmmaker scraping together credibility. She was one of the most recognizable women on the planet, which means the room didn't come in curious. It came in cautious. That's the first illusion people misunderstand about Sundance. They think visibility buys goodwill. At Sundance, visibility buys scrutiny. Every word is weighed. Every gesture is interpreted. Every pause is noticed. And when an audience senses that a message has been carefully pre-engineered rather than discovered in real time, they disengage fast. Not loudly, not rudely. They just stop giving you their attention. So let's rewind even further. Before the speech, before the empty seats, before the whispers. Let's talk about why Sundance rooms behave the way they do. Sundance audiences are not passive. They don't come to be entertained in the traditional sense. They come to evaluate, to test, to decide whether something deserves to exist beyond that room. These are people who pride themselves on spotting inauthenticity early, on being harder to please than mainstream audiences, on resisting narratives that feel overexplained or emotionally guided. They want to feel something on their own terms. And here's the contradiction that often trips people up. The more you try to control how an audience feels, the less they trust you. That's not a universal truth, but it is a Sundance truth. Which brings us to Cookie Queens and the way it was positioned. On paper, the documentary made sense. Purpose-driven, socially conscious, framed as a conversation starter, packaged as meaningful rather than commercial. But Sundance audiences don't evaluate projects on paper. They evaluate them in the moment. They ask, does this feel urgent? Does it feel necessary? Does it feel like it couldn't exist anywhere else? And when the answer feels ambiguous, attention drifts. Here's something most people don't realize. Sundance walkouts aren't always about dislike. Sometimes they're about prioritization. People bounce between screenings. They chase word of mouth. They follow buzz in real time. But context matters. Leaving during a film is one thing. Leaving during a live conversation is another. A conversation implies mutual presence. It's a social contract. You stay because someone is speaking to you, not at you. When that contract breaks, it signals something deeper. So what might have broken it here? Attendees later described a familiar sensation, one that seasoned festival goers know well. The sense that the conversation was heading somewhere predictable. Not wrong, not offensive, just anticipated. That's a dangerous place to be at Sundance. Because predictability is the enemy of discovery. If an audience believes they already know where you're going, they stop following. They check out emotionally before they check out physically. Once that happens, the room changes temperature. You can feel it when it happens. Speakers often do. Energy drops. Reactions flatten. The feedback loop disappears. And when that loop breaks, even confident speakers can falter. Here's where things get human. Imagine standing in front of a room full of people whose attention you expect to hold. You're talking about work you believe in. You're making points you've rehearsed, you're confident in your purpose, and then you sense it. Someone shifting, someone standing, a door opening quietly behind you. At first, you tell yourself it's nothing. People have schedules. It's a festival. It's fine. But then it happens again and again. And suddenly you're no longer speaking into a collective presence. You're speaking into a thinning one. That's not something training prepares you for. Public speaking coaches don't tell you what to do when your audience slowly evaporates in real time. Do you ignore it? Do you speed up? Do you intensify? Or do you harden? Some people respond by softening. They try to reconnect. They ask questions. They shift tone. Others respond by asserting. They lean into authority. They emphasize importance. They push through. Observers of the Sundance conversation claim the latter happened here, not explosively, not theatrically, but perceptibly. The tone sharpened. The delivery tightened. The emphasis shifted from inviting dialogue to defending relevance. Again, this is interpretation, but at Sundance, interpretation becomes reality because audiences don't just listen to words. They listen to posture, to pacing, to emotional subtext. And once an audience senses defensiveness, curiosity collapses, which raises a question you should sit with. Is it fair to expect a speaker to remain perfectly composed while being silently rejected, or is that expectation itself unrealistic? This is where opinions diverge sharply. Supporters argue that anyone would struggle under those circumstances, that the pressure was immense, that the scrutiny was unfair, that the festival environment is unforgiving by design. Critics argue something else. They argue that if your message depends on control, it won't survive an uncontrolled room. And Sundance rooms are nothing if not uncontrolled. They don't clap on cue. They don't nod politely out of obligation. They don't stay because someone is famous. They stay because something feels alive. Which brings us back to Prince Harry, because while Meghan spoke, Harry watched. And his role in that room was almost as telling as her words. He didn't interrupt. He didn't redirect. He didn't soften the moment. He sat still, quiet, observant. Some read that as support. Others read it as tension. But here's what matters. Harry has lived his entire life inside rooms where silence speaks louder than applause. Royal rooms, diplomatic rooms, rooms where body language communicates what words cannot. If anyone on that stage understood what was happening as people stood and left, it was him. Which raises another question. Was this moment unexpected or feared? Because Sundance had always been a risk. A high-reward risk, but a risk nonetheless. Unlike controlled interviews or produced documentaries, live festival conversations can't be edited after the fact. You can't remove pauses, you can't soften reactions, you can't crop empty seats. What happens in that room exists as it is, and when things go sideways, there's nowhere to hide. That's why seasoned industry figures approach Sundance cautiously. They don't overpromise. They don't assume warmth. They let the room come to them. But the Sussex brand has always been built on assertion, on framing, on narrative clarity. And that strategy doesn't always translate in spaces that prize ambiguity, which is why the aftermath of this moment mattered more than the moment itself. Because within hours, industry conversations began shifting. Quietly, text messages, side comments, raised eyebrows in other rooms. Nothing explosive, nothing public, just a recalibration. The kind that happens when people ask themselves whether a creative partnership or future invitation makes sense. And this is where the illusion truly shattered. Sundance isn't just about what happens on stage. It's about what happens after. Who gets invited back? Who gets whispered about? Who becomes shorthand for a cautionary tale? And once you're part of that shorthand, it sticks. Not because you failed, but because you revealed something. And what many insiders believe was revealed in that room wasn't anger, it was incompatibility, a mismatch between a tightly curated narrative and a space that resists curation, between a desire to be heard and an audience that refuses to be guided, between a brand built on control and a festival built on surrender. And that mismatch doesn't resolve itself easily, because it doesn't end with one event. It echoes in future invitations, in behind-the-scenes decisions, in the way rooms feel before you even enter them. But here's the twist most people missed. The empty seats didn't hurt the Sussexes because they signaled rejection. They hurt because they signaled indifference. And indifference is far more dangerous than criticism. Criticism keeps you relevant. Indifference makes you optional. And once a room decides you're optional, no amount of explanation can pull them back. Which leads us to what happened next. Because while the public focused on the speech, the real story unfolded behind closed doors, among festival organizers, among moderators, among people who decide who belongs in those rooms next year. And what they said afterward would quietly shape everything that followed. What if the film itself was never the problem? What if Cookie Queens didn't fail in that room, but also didn't do the one thing Sundance audiences demand most? Surprise them. Because once the conversation shifted from the walkouts to the work, from body language to substance, another tension surfaced. A quieter one, a more dangerous one. The tension between message and messenger. Let's talk about Cookie Queens. On the surface, it arrived wrapped in all the right language, purpose-driven, values-forward, framed as a documentary meant to spotlight overlooked voices, community, resilience, and empowerment. The kind of project that, in theory, should thrive in an environment like the Sundance Film Festival. And yet, something didn't land. Not because the themes were wrong, not because the cause was unworthy, but because of how familiar it felt. Here's the uncomfortable question Sundance audiences silently ask when a documentary is introduced. Why this story now? Not why does this matter, but why does this matter here? Those are very different questions. And Cookie Queens walked into a room that had already been primed with expectations. Not neutral expectations, but layered ones. Expectations shaped by years of interviews, statements, docuseries, and public narratives associated with its most visible champions. By the time the documentary was introduced, many in the room believed they already knew its emotional arc. That's not fair, but it's real. And Sundance audiences are ruthless about one thing above all else. They hate being emotionally pre-sold. They want discovery. They want friction. They want moments that feel unpolished, unresolved, even uncomfortable. What they resist is inevitability. Several attendees later described the same sensation, a creeping sense that the film's conclusions were already drawn before the conversation even began. That doesn't mean they disagreed with them. It means they didn't feel invited into the process of discovery. And that's a fatal flaw at Sundance, because Sundance isn't about telling people what to think. It's about letting them arrive there themselves. Which brings us to the core contradiction of Cookie Queens in that room. The documentary was positioned as a conversation starter, but the way it was discussed felt conclusive. Statements were framed with certainty. Themes were presented as settled. Moral framing was clear and confident. In most venues, that plays well. At Sundance, it can feel like being lectured. And that perception matters more than intent. Ask yourself this. When was the last time you stayed fully engaged in a talk where you felt the ending had already been decided? You might agree with every word and still feel restless. That restlessness is what causes people to shift in their seats, to glance at their phones, to quietly calculate whether their time might be better spent elsewhere. And once that calculation begins, it's hard to stop. The documentary itself, Cookie Queens, was never screened in isolation from its champions. It couldn't be. The identities of the speakers were inseparable from the project. That's both a blessing and a burden. On one hand, visibility guarantees attention. On the other, it guarantees projection. Audiences project intentions, motives, patterns. And many in that room projected something that had nothing to do with the actual subjects of the film. They projected fatigue, not fatigue with social issues, not fatigue with documentaries, but fatigue with a narrative framework they felt they had encountered before. This is where Sundance becomes brutally honest. It doesn't reject causes. It rejects repetition, and repetition doesn't always mean the same facts. It can mean the same emotional beats, the same rhetorical structures, the same sense of moral certainty, which leads to another uncomfortable question. Is it possible to be right and still lose the room? Sundance audiences believe the answer is yes, because they don't reward correctness, they reward curiosity. And when Cookie Queens was discussed, curiosity seemed to take a back seat to conviction. Again, this isn't an accusation, it's an observation drawn from how people reacted. Some nodded politely, some listened attentively, some stayed until the end, but others disengaged. And disengagement at Sundance is rarely about disagreement. It's about saturation. One attendee later described it like this: "The film felt less like an open question and more like a closing argument." That phrase stuck. A closing argument assumes the jury has already heard the case, that they've followed the evidence, that they're ready to be guided toward a verdict. But many in that room didn't feel like jurors. They felt like spectators to a conclusion they hadn't helped shape. And that's where the messenger matters as much as the message. Because when a project is closely associated with a public figure whose voice has already dominated similar conversations, audiences instinctively brace themselves. They don't lean in, they lean back, which creates a paradox. The very platform that allowed cookie queens to exist at Sundance also made it harder for Sundance audiences to receive it without resistance. That's not unique to Meghan Markle. It happens to many high-profile figures who enter indie spaces. But the stakes are higher when the brand is already polarizing. And make no mistake, by 2026, Meghan Markle was polarizing. Not universally disliked, not universally supported, but rarely neutral. Neutrality is gold at Sundance. It allows curiosity to flourish. Polarization does the opposite. It forces audiences to interrogate not just the work, but the intention behind the work. Why this film? Why this framing? Why this platform? Those questions hovered in the room long before anyone stood up to leave. And when Meghan spoke about cookie queens, she spoke with clarity and assurance. She articulated purpose. She emphasized impact. She framed the documentary within broader conversations about change and visibility. But clarity can feel like closure. And closure is something Sundance resists. One of the strangest dynamics at play was this. Many people in the room likely agreed with her, but agreement doesn't guarantee engagement. In fact, agreement can sometimes accelerate disengagement if the audience feels there's nothing left to uncover. That's the contradiction few public figures anticipate. You can win the argument and still lose the room, because Sundance isn't there to be convinced. It's there to be challenged. And Cookie Queens, at least in how it was presented that day, felt more like a statement than a challenge. Which raises another question worth asking yourself. If a documentary about empowerment is presented from a position of authority, does it still feel empowering? Or does it feel instructional? That line is thin. And crossing it doesn't require arrogance. It can happen simply through tone. Tone is everything at Sundance. A sentence delivered as an invitation can feel electric. The same sentence delivered as a conclusion can feel heavy. Observers noted that as the conversation progressed, the energy shifted away from exploration and toward emphasis. Points were reinforced rather than opened. Ideas were underlined rather than interrogated. Again, nothing objectively wrong. But Sundance is allergic to anything that feels settled. And when audiences sense that a speaker isn't discovering the ideas alongside them, but presenting them as finished, they emotionally step back. That's when attention fractures. And once attention fractures, even the most compelling content struggles to hold. The irony is that Cookie Queens might have thrived in a different setting. A university auditorium, a philanthropic summit, a curated media event. In those spaces, clarity is rewarded. Authority is respected. Purpose resonates. But Sundance doesn't operate on respect. It operates on skepticism. Which means the same project can be embraced in one venue and quietly resisted in another. That's not a failure of the work. It's a failure of alignment. And alignment is everything when it comes to festivals. This is where Prince Harry's presence again becomes significant. He didn't speak much about the film, but his posture and restraint suggested awareness of the room's temperature. At moments when the conversation leaned heavily into messaging, he remained quiet, observant. Almost as if he understood something that's easy to forget when you're emotionally invested in a project. You can't force resonance. You can only invite it, and invitations can be declined. That's what Sundance audiences did, not with outrage, but with movement, one by one, quietly, which brings us to the most misunderstood part of this entire episode. The walkouts weren't necessarily a rejection of Cookie Queens, they were a rejection of inevitability. They were a response to the feeling that the conversation was no longer evolving in real time. And that's devastating in a space built on evolution. Because Sundance is where stories are supposed to be unfinished, where ideas are supposed to be rough around the edges, where speakers are expected to admit uncertainty. Certainty closes doors. Uncertainty opens them. And in that room, many felt the doors closing. Not slammed shut, just gently pushed inward. So when people stood up and left, they weren't making a statement against the film. They were voting with their feet for discovery elsewhere. And once that happens, the damage isn't loud. It's cumulative. It shows up later in how people talk about the project, in how they frame the creators, in whether future invitations come with enthusiasm or obligation. Because Sundance remembers moments like this, not as scandals, but as. This is where the idea of empty seats takes on a second meaning, because even after the room physically emptied, metaphorical seats began emptying too. Seats at future panels, seats at curated conversations, seats at invitation-only gatherings that define influence more than any headline. And this didn't happen because Meghan Markle said something outrageous. It happened because the moment confirmed a fear some insiders already had, that the Sussex brand, once disruptive, had become predictable, that it no longer surprised rooms designed to reward surprise, that it spoke with certainty in spaces that prize doubt. Those fears didn't originate at Sundance, but Sundance validated them. Which brings us to the whispers. Not gossip, not leaks. Whispers. The kind that travel fast because they don't sound malicious. One phrase came up repeatedly among attendees, not a Sundance voice. That phrase doesn't mean bad. It means misaligned, and misalignment is hard to fix. Because Sundance isn't just an event. It's a gatekeeper. It influences what gets funding, what gets distribution, what gets critical patience. When Sundance decides you're not quite their voice, it doesn't blacklist you. It simply stops amplifying you. And amplification is everything. This is where the contradiction deepens. Meghan Markle and Prince Harry didn't come to Sundance, at least not publicly. They framed their appearance as participation, as contribution, as dialogue. But Sundance participation only works when the room feels you're there to listen as much as speak. And many insiders felt the balance tipped too far in one direction. Again, not maliciously, not arrogantly, but unmistakably. Which is why the post-event conversations shifted from content to posture. Not what did the film say, but how did it feel? Feeling is currency at Sundance. And the feeling people struggled to articulate was distance. Distance between speaker and audience, between message and moment, between intention and reception. That distance is what causes people to quietly disengage. It's also what causes industry figures to quietly recalibrate. One organizer reportedly asked a blunt question afterward. Is this what Sundance is for? That question doesn't accuse. It interrogates purpose, because Sundance guards its identity fiercely. It constantly asks whether it's drifting toward celebrity spectacle or staying rooted in discovery. And moments like this force that self-examination. Which means the Sussex appearance didn't just affect perceptions of them, it triggered introspection within the festival itself. That's a heavy consequence for a single conversation. But it also explains why the reaction was so cautious. No one wanted to make it about personalities, they wanted to make it about values. And Sundance values unpredictability above all else. That's why emerging filmmakers are often embraced even when their work is messy. Messy means alive. Polished certainty feels dead on arrival. This brings us back to Prince Harry again. Because while Meghan was the primary speaker, Harry's presence shaped perceptions too. Some insiders saw him as grounding, others saw him as constrained. But many noted the same thing. He seemed aware that the room wasn't responding the way they'd hoped. And awareness without intervention can feel like helplessness. It created a strange dynamic. One partner speaking with conviction, the other watching the room. That asymmetry didn't go unnoticed. It raised uncomfortable questions about internal dynamics. Who was steering the narrative? Who was reading the room? Who had the power to pivot if things went sideways? Those questions lingered long after the conversation ended. And in an industry obsessed with collaboration, imbalance is a red flag. Because festivals don't just evaluate projects. They evaluate teams. They ask, can these people adapt? Can they listen? Can they evolve in real time? Or do they arrive with conclusions already locked in? That's why the word rigid began to surface in some post-event discussions. Not publicly, never publicly, but privately. Rigid doesn't mean stubborn. It means resistant to feedback. And Sundance lives on feedback. Not applause-based feedback, but bodily feedback. Are people leaning forward? Are they shifting? Are they staying? When that feedback is ignored or overridden, the room responds by leaving. Which circles us back to the most painful irony of this entire episode. Meghan Markle has spent years speaking about being unheard, about voices being dismissed, about stories being sidelined, about institutions failing to listen. And here she was in a room built to listen, losing listeners. That irony wasn't lost on insiders, not as judgment, but as tragedy, because it suggested a widening gap between intention and effect, between the story she wanted to tell and how it was being received. And that gap doesn't close itself automatically. It requires recalibration. The question is whether recalibration is possible once a brand becomes this defined. Because Sundance isn't forgiving in the way mainstream media is. It doesn't grant endless reinvention attempts. It rewards those who arrive willing to be changed by the room. Which raises a critical question for you. Can someone whose public identity is built on narrative control truly surrender to a space that demands vulnerability and uncertainty? Or is that surrender too costly? That's the dilemma Sundance quietly posed to the Sussexes, without ever saying it aloud. And dilemmas like that don't get resolved on stage. They get resolved in future choices, in whether certain invitations are accepted or declined, in whether formats change, in whether voices soften or sharpen. Because after this appearance, something shifted, not dramatically, not explosively, but decisively. The Sussexes were no longer being discussed as disruptors, they were being discussed as fixtures. And fixtures don't excite Sundance. Fixtures are stable, predictable, familiar. Sundance craves the opposite, which leads us to what happened in the days that followed. Because while public coverage moved on, industry memory did not. And what insiders did next, who they called, who they didn't, what they reconsidered, revealed far more than any headline ever could. That's where this story turns from awkward moment to inflection point. And once that turn happened, there was no way to pretend the empty seats were meaningless. They had spoken, quietly, collectively, and permanently. But the most revealing consequence of all came later, when future opportunities began to look subtly different. And that's where the real fallout began. What if the fallout didn't look like rejection at all? What if it looked like opportunity, just quieter, cooler, and far less generous than before? Because that's how the next phase unfolded. Not with slammed doors or angry emails. Not with public snubs, but with subtle shifts so small you could miss them if you weren't paying attention. And most people weren't. They saw headlines fade. They saw the news cycle move on. They assumed the moment had passed. But inside the industry, something else was happening. A recalibration. Here's the thing about creative ecosystems like Sundance, or any serious cultural gatekeeping space. They don't react emotionally. They react strategically. They don't say no outright. They say maybe later. They say let's see. They say interesting timing. And those phrases are where momentum goes to die. In the weeks after the appearance, people began to notice small changes. Panels that once seemed like a given became under discussion. Invitations that might have arrived automatically now required follow-ups. Conversations that used to feel warm turned procedural. No one announced this shift. No one documented it. But people felt it. Because when a space like this cools on you, it doesn't do it loudly. It does it politely, which is far more dangerous. Here's a contradiction worth sitting with. Meghan Markle and Prince Harry didn't lose relevance after that moment. They lost inevitability. And in elite creative spaces, inevitability is currency. When people assume you'll be there next year, you're part of the landscape. When they start wondering whether you'll be there, you've slipped into optional territory. Optional is the worst place to be. Optional means your presence must now justify itself every single time. Before Sundance, the Sussexes benefited from curiosity. Even skepticism carried engagement. People leaned in because they wanted to see what would happen. After Sundance, the tone shifted from curiosity to assessment. Is there something new here? Is this evolving? Is this still worth the room? Those questions replaced anticipation. And once that happens, the burden increases. Because you're no longer being invited to surprise people. You're being invited to prove something. That's a subtle but devastating change. One industry figure put it bluntly in private. It's not that they can't come back. It's that now they'd have to come back differently. Differently how? That's the question no one wanted to answer directly. because answering it requires naming the thing people were avoiding. The perception of control. After Sundance, conversations about Meghan's public presence increasingly used the same language. Curated, managed, intentional. Those aren't insults. In many industries, they're compliments. But in indie creative spaces, they're red flags. Because curation implies premeditation. And Sundance thrives on discovery. This is where the contradiction becomes almost tragic. The very skills that helped Meghan navigate hostile media environments, precision, discipline, narrative clarity, worked against her in a space that wanted messiness. Sundance wants to see you think out loud. It wants hesitation, self-questioning. Moments where even the speaker isn't sure where they're going next. Those moments create trust. Certainty creates distance, and after that appearance, many felt the distance widen. This didn't mean people turned against her. It meant they stopped leaning in, and leaning in is everything. Meanwhile, Prince Harry's role continued to complicate perceptions. Some insiders began framing him as the softer presence, the one more likely to listen, more likely to adapt. But that framing created another problem. It suggested imbalance. In collaborative spaces, imbalance raises questions. Who leads? Who adjusts? Who absorbs feedback? And if one partner is perceived as more flexible than the other, the team as a whole gets scrutinized. That scrutiny intensified after Sundance. Not cruelly, not obsessively, just enough to matter. This is where the idea of future opportunities becomes crucial. Because no one barred the Sussexes from future festivals or panels. But the nature of those opportunities subtly shifted. Instead of headline conversations, side events became more likely. Instead of center stage moments, collaborative appearances were floated. Instead of leading the narrative, participating within it was suggested. Again, nothing explicit, but power dynamics changed. And power dynamics don't lie. The irony is that many of these adjustments were probably well-intentioned. Organizers didn't want to recreate tension. They didn't want to put anyone in an uncomfortable position. They wanted alignment. But alignment requires flexibility on both sides. And that's where uncertainty crept in. Would the Sussex brand allow for that kind of repositioning? Would it accept less control in exchange for deeper credibility? Or would it double down on certainty, choosing venues that rewarded clarity over curiosity? Those questions weren't answered publicly, but they were being asked privately. And private questions shape public futures. Here's another layer most people miss. Creative spaces don't just evaluate how you speak. They evaluate how you respond to feedback, not verbal feedback. Environmental feedback. The empty seats were feedback. The cooling afterward was feedback. The subtle repositioning of future opportunities was feedback. And how you respond to that feedback determines whether momentum returns or fades. Some creators respond by softening, by experimenting, by showing up differently next time. Others respond by retreating into control, by choosing safer spaces, by limiting exposure to unpredictable rooms. Which path would Meghan Markle choose? That was the unspoken question hovering over industry conversations. Because Sundance wasn't just a moment. It was a mirror, and mirrors don't flatter. They reflect. For some, that reflection inspires change. For others, it reinforces defenses. The danger lies in mistaking defense for strength, because while control can protect you, it can also isolate you. And isolation is the enemy of cultural relevance. This is where the idea of fatigue resurfaces. Not audience fatigue alone, but institutional fatigue. Institutions get tired of navigating tension. They prefer ease. They prefer flow. They prefer collaborators who adapt to the room rather than reshape it. After Sundance, some insiders worried that any future engagement with the Sussexes would require excessive management. Not because of bad behavior, but because of perception. Perception that the room would need to be carefully curated, that reactions would need to be managed, that outcomes would need to be protected. And that kind of overhead makes institutions hesitant, because festivals want risk on screen, not behind the scenes. Which brings us to a quiet but telling development. In the months that followed, other voices began to occupy similar spaces. Less famous, less polished, more uncertain. And those voices were rewarded. They were messy. They contradicted themselves. They admitted they didn't have answers. and Sundance loved them. Not because they were better people, but because they embodied the festival's spirit. That contrast sharpened perceptions of the Sussex moment. It became a reference point, not as a scandal, but as an example. An example of what happens when a highly managed public identity enters a space that resists management. That example didn't need to be repeated aloud. It lived in memory, which brings us to the most important consequence of all: trust. Trust isn't about liking someone. It's about believing they'll meet the room where it is. After Sundance, some questioned whether Meghan Markle could or would do that. Not out of malice, but out of self-preservation. Because meeting the room means relinquishing control. And relinquishing control can feel dangerous when you've been burned before. That's the tension at the heart of this story. A woman who learned to protect herself through precision, stepping into a space that demanded vulnerability. A festival that rewards uncertainty, encountering a speaker who values clarity. Neither side wrong, but deeply mismatched. And mismatches leave marks. They don't explode. They imprint. They shape future expectations. They alter trajectories, and once those trajectories shift, returning to the old path becomes harder than starting a new one, which leads us to what came next. Because the Sussexes didn't disappear after Sundance, they kept working, they kept creating, they kept speaking. But the rooms they entered began to feel different, smaller, more controlled, less risky. And that choice, whether intentional or not, revealed how deeply the Sundance moment had landed. Not as humiliation, but as information. Information about where they fit, information about where they didn't, and information, once absorbed, changes behavior. The question is whether it also changes identity. Because the next chapter of this story isn't about what Sundance thought of Meghan Markle. It's about what Meghan Markle thought of Sundance, and whether she would ever step into a room like that again, knowing what it demands. That's where this story turns inward. And that turn would shape everything that followed. What if the most revealing shift wasn't visible at all? What if it happened internally, quietly, privately, in the space between public confidence and personal recalculation? Because after Sundance, something subtle but profound appeared to change. Not in headlines, not in statements, but in behavior. And behavior tells the truth long before words do. Here's the question few people asked at the time. What did Meghan Markle take away from that room? Not what she said publicly, not what her team implied afterward, but what she felt. Because moments like Sundance don't just test your work, they test your relationship with uncertainty. And uncertainty has always been a complicated space for her. Let's be honest about something. Meghan Markle did not come up through indie film circuits. She didn't spend years pitching rough cuts to skeptical rooms. She didn't build her public voice through trial and error in hostile creative spaces. Her rise followed a different trajectory: television, visibility, institutional structures, clear roles, defined expectations. Even her entry into the royal family followed rigid frameworks, protocol, hierarchy, messaging, until those frameworks collapsed. And when they collapsed, she adapted the way many people do after institutional betrayal. She learned control. Control over narrative, control over access, control over messaging. Control became safety. So when she stepped into Sundance, she wasn't just stepping into a festival. She was stepping into a space that asks you to loosen the very muscles you've spent years strengthening. That's not easy. It's not intuitive, and it's not fair to expect it to happen overnight. But Sundance doesn't care about fairness. It cares about fit, which raises a difficult question. Was the Sundance experience a rejection or a warning? A warning that certain spaces demand a version of vulnerability she may not be willing or able to offer. Because vulnerability in this context doesn't mean emotional exposure. It means intellectual exposure, admitting uncertainty, letting ideas breathe without steering them, allowing silence without filling it. Those are skills, learned skills, and they are very different from resilience. Resilience protects you from harm. Vulnerability invites risk. After years of being scrutinized, criticized, and dissected, risk is not something most people run toward. So when Sundance reflected back something uncomfortable, the natural response wasn't collapse, it was consolidation. And that consolidation showed up in subtle ways. Subsequent appearances leaned more controlled. Formats became tighter, Messaging became clearer, not looser. Some might call that professionalism. Others saw it as retreat. But here's the contradiction. In many environments, doubling down on control would be the right move. In Sundance adjacent spaces, it confirms misalignment, which is why some insiders began framing the moment not as a failure, but as a fork in the road. One path led deeper into unpredictable creative spaces, the other led toward curated influence. Neither path is wrong, but they lead to very different kinds of relevance. Sundance rewards the first. Mainstream platforms reward the second. After the festival, it became increasingly clear which direction felt safer. And safety, after years of public conflict, is seductive. This is where Prince Harry's role becomes even more telling. Harry has always occupied a strange position between institutions and rebellion, between tradition and escape, between structure and chaos. He understands rigid systems, he understands what happens when they break, and he understands the cost of vulnerability, which makes his silence during and after Sundance fascinating. He didn't contradict, he didn't redirect. He didn't publicly frame the moment as misunderstood. He let it pass. That restraint suggests something important. It suggests recognition that the room had spoken, recognition that pushing back wouldn't change the verdict, and recognition that the lesson wasn't about one speech, but about fit. That recognition doesn't always lead to change. Sometimes it leads to avoidance, because stepping into spaces that challenge your instincts requires emotional bandwidth. And emotional bandwidth is finite. After Sundance, the Sussexes continued producing content, but the venues changed. More controlled environments, more predictable audiences, more sympathetic frameworks. That shift didn't happen overnight, but it happened. And it reveals something essential. They weren't retreating from influence. They were choosing the kind of influence that didn't require surrender. That choice makes sense, but it comes with trade-offs. Because when you choose safety, you often sacrifice surprise. And surprise is what keeps cultural relevance alive. This brings us back to the core irony of the empty seats. They weren't just seats. They were a signal that not all rooms can be mastered through preparation. Some rooms want to master you instead, and that's a hard truth for anyone whose survival has depended on being prepared. One creative strategist described the situation perfectly. They walked into a room that didn't want to be led. That sentence explains everything. Sundance doesn't want leaders. It wants explorers. Explorers get lost. They contradict themselves. They revise their thinking in real time. Leaders present conclusions, and conclusions feel heavy in spaces built on questions. So what happens when someone accustomed to leading enters a room that resists leadership? They feel exposed, not attacked, not humiliated. Exposed, exposure can either soften you or harden you. After Sundance, it appeared to harden strategy, not personality, not intent, strategy. And strategy determines trajectory. This is where the story stops being about one festival and starts being about long-term positioning. Because every public figure eventually has to answer this question: do I want to be influential or unpredictable? Those two qualities rarely coexist. Influence requires consistency. Unpredictability requires risk. Sundance prioritizes the second. Mainstream platforms reward the first. After the Sundance moment, the Sussexes' subsequent choices suggested a clear preference, and that preference didn't go unnoticed. Industry watchers began categorizing their work differently, less as creative exploration, more as branded impact. Again, not an insult, but a repositioning. Repositioning narrows options. It clarifies audiences. It streamlines messaging. But it also closes doors quietly, doors that only open to people willing to be uncertain. Which raises the final question of this section. Was Sundance ever the right room? Or was it a necessary misstep, a moment that clarified boundaries on both sides? Because sometimes failure isn't about falling short. It's about discovering where you don't belong. And discovering that early can save you years of frustration. But it can also limit growth. Growth happens in discomfort. And Sundance offered discomfort in its purest form. A room that didn't applaud on cue, an audience that didn't stay out of politeness, a space that refused to bend. The empty seats weren't cruel. They were honest. And honesty, while painful, is valuable. The question is what you do with it. Do you adjust or do you move on? Because the answer to that question determines whether this moment becomes a footnote or a turning point. And the signs that followed suggest it was the latter. But the most revealing consequences hadn't surfaced yet. They wouldn't appear in headlines or programs. They would appear in the kind of invitations that never arrive, in the conversations that quietly stop happening, and in the realization, slow and undeniable, that some rooms close not with a slam, but with silence. And once silence sets in, getting back inside is harder than anyone admits. That's where this story heads next. What if the silence that followed was louder than anything said on stage? Because after the dust settled, after the headlines thinned out and the social chatter moved on, something far more telling began to happen. Nothing. No public confrontation. No dramatic rebuttal. No loud defense. Just nothing. And in industries like film, media, and cultural productions, silence isn't neutral. Silence is data. Here's what most people don't understand about moments like Sundance. The real consequences don't show up immediately. They unfold over time in patterns that only insiders recognize. You don't see them in trending topics, you feel them in absence. An email that never comes, a follow-up that stalls, a name that quietly drops out of conversation. That's when you know something has shifted. After Sundance, people began to notice those absences. Not fans, not critics, professionals. People who book rooms. People who curate conversations. People who decide whose voice adds value and whose presence adds complexity. And the feedback loop that had once felt automatic began to falter. Before, the Sussexes' involvement alone generated buzz. Even skepticism carried heat. Panels filled because people wanted to see what would happen. Afterward, curiosity cooled. Not into hostility, into calculation. Is this worth the room? Is this worth the risk? Is this worth the management? Those questions don't sound dramatic, but they determine everything. Because cultural capital isn't about popularity, it's about ease. And after Sundance, ease disappeared. This is where the story takes a turn that's easy to miss if you're not looking closely. The Sussexes didn't lose platforms. They lost frictionless access. Every future appearance now required justification. Why this venue? Why this format? Why now? Justification slows momentum. Momentum is oxygen. Without oxygen, influence doesn't die. It shrinks. It becomes narrower, more contained. And containment is the opposite of what Sundance offers. Sundance thrives on expansion of ideas, of voices, of possibility. So when someone's presence begins to feel containing rather than expansive, the ecosystem reacts. Not aggressively, defensively. It protects itself. This is why some insiders quietly admitted that the Sundance appearance made them nervous. Not because of controversy, but because of predictability. Predictability creates risk of stagnation, and stagnation is poison to festivals. They want audiences buzzing, arguing, debating, disagreeing, but staying. Empty seats are the only thing they can't afford. Which brings us back to the image everyone keeps returning to, rows with gaps. That image became shorthand, not in memes, not in articles, in meetings. People would reference it without naming it. You know, that moment. Everyone knew what they meant. That's how you know something has lodged itself into institutional memory. Institutional memory doesn't care about nuance. It remembers outcomes. And the outcome of that conversation was simple. The room thinned, which led to an unspoken recalibration. Some organizers began thinking twice about placing high-profile figures in center-stage conversational formats, not just the Sussexes, anyone whose presence might overwhelm the room, because Sundance conversations are supposed to feel shared. Once that balance tips, the format collapses, and formats matter. This is another piece the public rarely sees. Sundance doesn't just curate people, it curates experiences. And experiences depend on chemistry. After Sundance, some insiders questioned whether Meghan Markle's chemistry worked best in one-directional formats. Speeches, produced documentaries, edited interviews, spaces where message control protects intent. But Sundance conversations are porous, unscripted, unforgiving. They reveal hesitation, they amplify tone. They magnify discomfort. And discomfort, if unmanaged, spreads. That's why the question shifted. Not Was the message right? But was this the right medium? And once that question surfaces, future opportunities get reframed. Instead of live conversations, maybe pre-recorded segments. Instead of panels, maybe curated showcases instead of dialogue presentation. Again, not exile, redirection. But redirection is still a consequence because it narrows the field. It says, this is where you function best, and anything outside that lane becomes less likely. Which leads us to something deeply ironic. For years, Meghan Markle spoke about wanting to be part of conversations, not performances, about dialogue, not dictate. But Sundance revealed how difficult true dialogue can be when power dynamics are uneven. When one voice arrives, already amplified, dialogue becomes complicated, because dialogue requires mutual vulnerability. And vulnerability is risky when you're already under scrutiny. So the safer move is to choose formats that protect you. And protection, while necessary, changes how you're perceived. Protected voices feel distant. Distant voices don't fill rooms. This is where the emotional core of this story emerges. Not embarrassment, not anger. Disappointment. Disappointment on both sides. For Sundance, it was the disappointment of a moment that didn't ignite. For Meghan, likely the disappointment of a space that didn't receive her as hoped. And disappointment hardens. It doesn't explode. It calcifies. That calcification is what makes return difficult. Because returning would require reopening vulnerable.